And that's how we live as family. When we get together, we get to hear each other's stories and share in the adventures. Sounds like an adventure that you had. Okay, so tonight we're here at Bible study, and for some reason, Scott and I keep getting our wires crossed. He thought he was supposed to teach today, and then I'm teaching today because I know I'm supposed to teach today, and this has happened multiple times for us. So I don't know. He's on next week. So no, actually, is he on next week? Yeah, you are on next week. Yeah. Okay, so I'm here. Because last month that I taught on the kingdom and the king. I don't know if you remember that. And for some reason, you know what, you're going on a journey with me because I don't know where I'm going with all of this that I am teaching presently, but this is just where the Lord is leading me. And as he shows me things, I am going to then share them with you. So, When last we met, if you weren't here for that teaching, I would advise you to go listen to that teaching and then come back to this one. But go ahead and listen. You know, for right now, don't leave right now. Just listen because you'll get something out of this anyway. But when last we spoke, I was talking about the kingdom. And that's kind of where my mind is, and I know that's kind of where I'm going. I just don't know where the end result is. But I want us to consider in Acts chapter 17, 24 through 25. I'm just going to paraphrase it, but I'm giving you the scriptures because I know some of you do take notes, and some of you have your hard copy Bibles. So impressed. And you're flipping through the pages getting there. Acts chapter 17, 24 through 25 says something like, let's consider that God made the world. He made everything in it. This is stuff that I spoke of on the last teaching. And that he alone is the Lord of heaven and earth. And that he does not want to be worshiped through creation. And specifically, he doesn't want to be worshiped through the creation of images and idols that were created by man. He doesn't want that. He's very, very clear on that. Because he alone gave life. He alone breathed life into every living thing, and man himself, humanity, was already created in God's image. You and I, whether we recognize it or not, and I think this is some of the thrust that God is impressing upon me that I'm sharing with you as I'm getting it, that we need to go back to the beginning and recognize and realize and embrace the fact that we were made in God's image. And he doesn't want us, man, to worship him through the creation of the things that we're making. And a lot of things that we make in this day and age, we make these great big buildings, or we make this great, long epic movie, or we make this great book, or we make this and that. And this is how we become popular, and this is how we gain honor and prestige and all of these things. And we won Nobel Peace Prizes and Oscar awards and Grammy awards. And all of these things are the creation of the things that we're doing. And we're worshiping one another because, oh, wow, did you see what he was able to do? Or did you see what she did? Or did you see what they created or what they made or what they discovered? And all of these things we're giving a lot of prestige and honor and worship, if you will, to people, to one another, when God wants us to worship him alone. Considering that he is the Lord of heaven and earth and has created all of these things, he wants us to worship him. And there is a significance to having created you and I in his image. And that's kind of what I want to explore tonight. So 3 notes of observation that I'm going to reiterate tonight. I'm not going to get in depth. You can re-listen to it, or you can listen to it for the first time, the last teaching on the kingdom and the king. The first one is that as we went through the scriptures and as we were going through the study, God, from Genesis to Exodus, and that's about as far as I got, never referred to himself as king. I just make one note of that. Observe the fact that it is a fact that he never referred to himself in Genesis as king. He never did. Number 2, this is one of the things I focused on as I ended. God did not want a king for his people. He explicitly, clearly stated, I do not want a king for my people. Now, I'm paraphrasing. You can go back and reread exactly how he said it, but he didn't want a king for his people. He told Samuel that. And number three, and this is where we're going to kind of jump off. This is our springboard for tonight's lesson. It says in Exodus 19, 5 through 6, Moses was on Mount Sinai and God was speaking commandments to Moses, and I want you to tell the people these things. And he says, now therefore, as he's telling Moses what to state to the people, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And then he says in verse 6, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that I want you to speak to the children of Israel, Moses. And so my focus initially was about this kingdom and its king, and recognizing he never referred to himself as a king. And although he says very clearly to Moses, I want a kingdom, but it is a kingdom of priests. And so before I go even further into the kingdom and all of that, I think I need to stop and pause. And I think that's, I believe he wants us to demonstrate and be an example to one another. And I think that's why he's having me do this, because I had to stop and consider, well, wait a second, what does that mean? If that's what he wanted, a kingdom of priests, then I think it begs the question, well, what is a priest? Because that's what he said he wanted. I want for me a kingdom of priests, and that is what I want you to be. So tonight, we're just going to look upon this concept of a priest. What are they, and what do they do? And some of this information, as I studied and I researched, there's obviously going to be some scriptures that I'm going to give, but a lot of this is from notes that I looked through as I was studying this, and it came from the Bible Project, so I'm going to just be honest with you. Some of this information comes from there because it really informed me of things that I was not aware of, and here I am. I'm just going to relay them with you because I think there's some important concepts here. So that word priest, I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of a priest. You know, immediately when I think of a priest, I think of the guy that's dressed all in black with the little white thing right here. You know, the priest. And I've never been Catholic. I mean, I've been to Catholic churches, but I was never Catholic. But that's what I think of. I think of a priest. You know, I think of some minister of some kind. And depending on what background you're from, what you were raised in, that's going to kind of color and frame the image of what a priest is to you. But priests play a big role in the biblical story. If you know the biblical story, you know that the priest became a prominent role somehow, somewhere in this biblical story. But one thing that you have to recognize is that when you go through the Bible, those who were called priests or were given priestly duties often failed, and failed miserably. They didn't really live up to their calling. So when we look at the examples of priests in the Bible, we also have to recognize the fact that it's hard to understand what a priest truly is because a lot of them just didn't fulfill their calling. I mean, obviously, if you read through Hebrews, you would recognize that even the priests were fallen. If you read through the book of Hebrews, it says the priests were ministers for God, mediating between God and man and between man and God. And so he represented the people to God, but he also represented God to the people. But even he had to bring forth sacrifices and bring sprinkling of the blood, not just for the people's sins, but for who? His own sins. He had to deal with that as well. And as a high priest, that's what he did. And so all of these stories up to this point, eventually, as you read through the scriptures, they're all pointing toward this ultimate priest. This priest is Jesus. And it's he who restores all of the things that were found in the very beginning. And I think I spoke last time that I read this book that brought me back to Genesis. And the title of it was, In the Beginning, We Misunderstood. And I'm reading things and I'm rethinking, I'm relooking at things to recognize that, there are some things that we just kind of took for granted, and we really didn't study in depth into them. And I'm starting to realize, that I didn't know there was another way to think about it. Just like, I was raised all my life going to Christian schools, and it was just a fact that the Trinity doctrine. I was just raised in that. That was I never, ever heard of any other type of doctrine regarding God other than the Trinity. It was just, that was just common. And then all of a sudden I ran to this oneness of God. I didn't know there was another thought or perspective on the matter. And so I think that's what God is doing with me, because we never get to a point where we fully understand everything. We see through a glass dimly, and sometimes we have a focus, and sometimes there's just like blind spots, or there's kind of blurry spots, and God is polishing that glass until we can see more clearly, day by day, as we continue to pursue him, as we continue to seek him. And so when you think about, well, where did this all start? It started in the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden, what was there was rivers flowing from the garden, and there was a tree, and there was many trees, and there was living creatures, and there was all of these things. And the first people that were created was Adam. And we talked about that last week as well. Adam meaning all humanity, but also Adam and Eve. And they were created to rule creation. Right from there, they were established to rule. And we're going to look at that more closely in just a few minutes. But before we move on into this kingdom, I think it's important to have a better way to put it is a better understanding of this priestly role or this priestly duty. So let's look at priest according to the Bible. Does anybody know when the first person was identified as a priest in the Bible? Oh, wow, Melchizedek, that's right. And Melchizedek was the king of Salem. So he was also a king. He was a king and he was a priest, because it says in Genesis chapter 14 that he was the king of Salem and he was the priest of the Most High God. And then that's kind of all it says. I mean, the Bible is not written to help us understand all of the different roles that were in existence in the ancient world. Because remember, it's not written to us. The Bible is not written to us in this room. It was written to them in their day. So when we try to look into what is a priest and all of this stuff, we have to understand it from the ancient world perspective. And that's something that's just broadened my understanding right now. Because we like to read the scriptures and we like to interpret the scriptures based upon our modern day understanding of reality and existence, but that was not their understanding. They didn't have a lot of, they didn't know the earth was a globe back then. They didn't know about there's a galaxy, there's this Milky Way, and there's these asteroids that come, like Halley's, a comet that comes around every 75 years. They didn't understand any of that. None of that. It was just like a canvas in the sky with different, sparkly things. They didn't know there were stars and suns out there and other planets out there. They had no concept of that. We have the concept. So when we read the scriptures, we try to interpret it based upon our understanding today, but that was not their understanding back then. And God was speaking to them in their generation. And so if he's speaking to them in their generation, then he's going to speak to them according to their understanding, not ours. Because they had a particular understanding of things. And they did, in that day, have an understanding about priests. So, anybody know who was the second person that was recognized as a priest or identified as a priest in the scriptures? It was in Genesis. What do you think? Aaron? Oh, Aaron was way in Exodus, and he'll be the fourth one that I come to. But no, there was a priest before that. So let me bring you to the story, because you all know the story. Joseph. Joseph went to Egypt. Joseph ended up marrying, anybody know? Pharaoh's daughter, and her father, it says, was the priest of On. That's the second time this word priest comes into the scriptures. She marries the daughter of a priest in Egypt. And then the third time that we see this word priest being used. Anybody? Any guesses? There you go. He's got 2 out of 3 already. So Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses, and it says he was the priest of Midian. He was the priest of a certain area, of a certain people, the Midianites, if you will. He was a priest over there. And so we read that. It's like, oh, that's interesting. You got Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God, Yahweh, the one that Abraham had already recognized, which is another rabbit hole you can go down. Like you read the scriptures and you read about Abraham being called out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and he's the one that recognizes Yahweh, and then all of a sudden this king of Salem comes out of nowhere, and he's actually worshiping the same God of Abraham. And this is the first time they ever met. Well, how's that? I thought it was only Abraham that was called out. Well, it seems like God was talking to other people at the time, because he already had a priest, and it was the king of Salem. But anyways, that's a rabbit hole. And then we get to the fourth example. I think you mentioned Aaron. Aaron was a high priest. So there's a problem with understanding what a priest is just by looking at those four examples. Because all it is identifying who was a priest. It's not telling you what a priest did, what their duties were, what exactly a priest was back in that day. Priests are introduced in the Bible in this way, and it's left ambiguous. It really is, as to who they are and what they do. So let me present to you an idea of what a priest is according to the scriptures. And I think I said this last time I taught. A priest is one that represents God to the people, and then, I think I said it earlier today, and then represents the people to God. So he stands like a mediator, one who's in between two people to represent both parties, if you will. But in the ancient world, they understood the priest in a more detailed way, and this is kind of what I want to show you today. So the priest is a biblical category. It is a category of a certain role of that someone played in the scriptures or in the ancient world. And his job, the priest's job, was to represent and embody God's heavenly, divine presence on earth, especially in sacred places, in sacred roles, the priest himself. And I want to show you how, we're getting this idea. But the priests weren't the only ones to represent and express the divine authority of all of creation in the earth. There were actually three roles, and you probably are familiar with them all if you know anything about the scriptures. So we got the priest over here. Does anybody know any other biblical category or role that represents the divine in the earth? Any ideas? A king. That's right. A king. And I'm going to show you that today. I'm going to show you. I'll show you that with the scriptures, and hopefully with records from the ancient world, so that you can realize that. There's one more role. Does anybody know? Priest, a king, and a prophet. That's right. So you've got this intersection of different roles, but the prophet represents God's word in the earth. If you know about the prophets in the scriptures, they were there speaking the oracles of God. They were speaking it to the people of God. They were speaking it to the kings of his people. They were speaking it to other kings, the oracles of God. So they kind of represented God's word in the earth. And in a sense, sometimes God's power, because the power flowed through the prophets in a mighty way. But the same thing with the king. The king was representative of God's presence in the earth and his rule, his powerful rule in the earth. So you got the king with his presence and his rule, his authority. You got the prophet with his word, and then we have the priest. The priest. So all of them are converging at this area, and this is the area of the divine. They are expressing the divine in the earth in different ways. You have the prophet, you have the king, and you have the priest. So, yeah, as I said, the priest embodies God's divine heavenly presence in the earth in sacred places. The king is in government, and the prophet is generally speaking to the people of God or to kings. So the priest and the prophet and the king are all biblical categories that partially represent something core to God, to his divine presence, his word, and his power. And they embodied it in a human form. And that's what I want us to realize and recognize. They embodied the divine presence, power, the word of God as a human on the earth. Now, the priesthood is just a part of this triad, if you will, of roles and categories. And the story of the Bible is about humanity being created in God's image. And remember, in the garden, they were created in God's image to do what? To rule. It doesn't use the word priest for Adam and Eve. I understand that. But you have to understand that they were created to extend and express the divine authority of Creator God, where? In the earth, specifically in the earth. And it is only after the rebellion that all of these three got broken apart. And it became a lot harder to understand God, in a sense, because they were supposed to work in tandem together to represent aspects or roles of God to people. So, when we only focus on the theme of the priesthood of the Bible, and we separate it apart from the Garden of Eden, we kind of can get lost. And so we have to go back to the garden and remember, humans were created in the image. An image, remember I also spoke about that word image in the last teaching. Image was to resemble, to be the likeness of the one that they are representing. We humans are made in the image of God because we are here to represent God to each other, or God in the earth. That's what we're supposed to do. And so if we don't go back to the beginning, we kind of put the cart before the horse, if you will. If we don't understand, well, wait a second, let's go back to the beginning and understand the significance and the importance of humans. So if we turn to Genesis chapter 1, we'll see this very clearly. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. And this is part of the days, the 6 days of creation, the 7 days of creation. 7 day God rested. I say 6 days of creation because that's what he was creating. And he appointed humanity as God's image. And it says, Genesis, what did I have here? Genesis 1, 26 through 28. And God said, let us make human, or man, Adam, in our image according to our likeness. I want him to be my representation. That's what it is, to be in the image, to be in the likeness. For what purpose? That's the next few verses. And let them rule. Rule over what? Over the fish, over the birds, over the cattle, over the land, over every creeping thing that creeps on the land. They are to have authority, rule over all that God created for man. Now, does that take away his natural authority to be, authority over all that? Of course not. But for some reason, he delegated authority to one made in his image to continue exercising his rule through man. And then it says again, and God created human or man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. And then we also said it wasn't just him only. It wasn't just Adam, because the very next phrase says, male and female, he created them. So I'm only highlighting this, what sometimes seems obvious, but we kind of overlook it, that man is both male and female. Male and female are supposed to exercise his divine authority in the earth. Not just man, or the male, if you will. And so God blessed them. He said, be fruitful, be multiply, fill the land, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that creeps upon the land. And if you remember how God came to the earth, it was formless, it was void, it was a wasteland, it was tovu vavohu. I told you that, last time, that interesting little Hebrew phrase. And it just means it was just a wild wasteland. There was no purpose in it. And God created purpose. During those first 6 of creation, first he created order through separation. And then on the 4th, 5th, and 6th day, he filled what he put order in so that they could have life on this, what we call God's green earth. And so when he created them on the last day, not the last day, but the 6th day of his creative days, the last day of the creative days, he created man, and man was the pinnacle of all of his creation. They were made completely different from all the other creatures. And not just because they walked on 2 feet. He gave them something that he did not give the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, the cattle on the land. He made man in his image. That is the distinct difference between all the other creation. So I emphasize that the purpose of humanity's appointment as his divine image is so that they would rule over his creation. So now let me read to you something that I thought was important, and it's kind of re-emphasizing what I'm trying to share here tonight. There's an author named J. Richard Middleton. He wrote this book called The Liberating Image, the Imago Dei, in Genesis.1. And he says, the God who rules creation by his authoritative word is also the supreme artisan who constructs a complex and habitable cosmic structure, meaning the earth, because the earth was uninhabitable in the beginning. When he came to it, he then produced order. And when he did that, the humans were called, were created, were formed and fashioned and breathed in with the breath of life to imitate, to continue God's creative activity by populating and organizing and remaining the unformed and unfilled earth, because it was still not yet complete in a sense. Everything was there in potential, but he wanted man to continue. That's why he said, man, multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, and rule over it. There was still a bit of work to be done, but it wasn't going to be his work because he'd done everything necessary. He rested, as we know, on the 7th day, and then he wanted man to continue the project, if you will. The project that he had started with the earth. So God has, in other words, he started the process of forming, he started the process of filling, and now humans, as God's earthly delegates, are to continue that work in the earth. So now, that's kind of the scriptures behind it. That's mainly the scriptures. I told you before that sometimes we have to, and I came from a ministry that highly emphasized, right before I came to this ministry, they highly emphasized that in order for us to understand the scriptures, many times it's incredibly important that you understand the history alongside it. Because without the history, again, our natural way of understanding things is to understand them through our experiences. It's a very natural thing. It's not a wrong thing. That's just naturally what we do. When we come across something new that we've never experienced before, we try to understand it based upon our experiences. That's a normal action. But when we come into the scriptures, recognizing that it wasn't written to us, it was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. So if it was written to another people of another time in another generation, and it was written in their language, it was written in their perspective of their day, then we need to make sure that we understand it initially according to their perspective so that we can come out with some proper conclusions. Because otherwise we kind of get off on it because we didn't recognize that, no, we misunderstood that because he wasn't talking about what I understand it today. He was talking to them about how they understood their reality, their world at the time. So to understand the significance of the calling of this humanity, I just want to make some historical information and relay to you so you would understand why this humans were to be the image and the representation of deity. If you look at other ancient Near Eastern culture, not Far East is the Asia side, Near East is the kind of the Middle East side that we know today, the Near East culture, like Mesopotamia and Babylon and Egypt and all those nations that we're very familiar with, their deities represented, or excuse me, I shouldn't say that. Their images that they created, the statues and the wood and the stone, were made to represent the deities. So let me read you just a few examples of this. So in Syria, there was a king named Hadad-Iti, and his statue was dedicated to the god Adad, but that's in our biblical terminology, that's Baal. And the statue was the patron god of Syria, and it is described as the statue is of the king, and it represents Adad's authority. So when they had a king, that king represented the authority of their god, and he embodied and represented them to the people. That's how they interpreted their king. He was the embodiment of Baal in the earth. He was the human form of Baal, and that's how they saw it. That's how the ancient world saw their kings. If you go into Egypt, same thing. The Pharaoh was called the image of Re. Re is the sun deity. Maybe you've heard him as Ra, the sun god, Ra. Well, it says here the image of Re. I guess it depends on your translation. But he was the chief Egyptian god. When you go to Pharaoh Amhos I, that was in 1550 BC, it says he was called the prince of Re, the child of Keb. His heir is the image of Re, meaning the god, whom he created, the representative for whom he had set himself on earth. I'm bringing these examples to you because I'm trying to let you know that in the ancient world, kings were representative of deity to the people. That's why they created these statues. And they even inscribed on these statues these things about their king. So there was a queen that reigned, and it says, she is the superb image of Ammon, the image of Ammon on the earth. That's how they thought of their queen and their king, their leaders. They were the images of deities, and they were living monuments on the earth, is what it says. That was inscribed there. And so I can read a couple more examples, but I'm just giving you that concept that that's how the ancient world perceived their kings, their leaders, their chiefs, if you will. It even says it in their letters. So it says here, the letter written during the reign of an Assyrian king, it says, the king, the Lord of the world, is the very image of Shamash. Again, referring to the deity that they believed in. It says of this king, he is the father of the king. My Lord was the very image of Baal. And the king, my Lord, is likewise the very image of Baal. They wrote that in their letters because that's how they thought of their kings. And I told you in the last touching, we don't really have a concept of kings in our day because we're not governed by kings. We're governed with a completely different government, so it's hard for us to really understand what it is in the ancient times when we read the scriptures, what it is they thought of as a king. And I'm just sharing it with you so that you'd have a better understanding of what it is that they thought when they talked about kings. And maybe you'll understand why God said, I don't want a king for my people. Because they're going, again, what did Israel want? We talked about this last week. We want a king like all the other nations. And if we get a king like all the other nations, then the way that they thought of their king as a representative deity to them, that's what they're going to do. They're going to think of that king as their God. Their spiritual head honcho leader. And then they're not going to come to me anymore because remember God said, they don't want me to reign over them. That's kingship talk. To reign, to rule, to have authority, that's kingly talk. They didn't want that. And that's why God did not want it, because he understood how these men in this generation, how they understood it. And he didn't want that because he alone is God. He alone is king, even though he never mentioned himself as a king. He was the sovereign ruler, the Lord of all heaven and earth. So this word image in the Hebrew is salam, and the likeness is demot. They're most commonly used to refer to physical statues, either carven statues of stone or of wood. but it's that same word. That same word image that they use for statues of stone and wood is the very same word God used when he said, let us make them in our image, in our likeness, because they were supposed to be living images, not stone images that can't hear, can't see, can't talk. No, we are the living images of God to represent him to fellow man on the earth. And so we're to rule with them. So if you go back to, or if you think about Genesis.1:6, there's another author that his last name is Ner, I think. And he wrote in his book, In Search of Yahweh's Cult Statue in the First Temple, he says, Genesis 1:26 can only be understood, what we're talking about today, this can only be understood in the background of an ancient Yahweh statue. I'm not talking about a statue of wood. I'm not talking about a statue of stone. Humanity, man, Adam, is what is regarded as the quote-unquote statue of God, the image, the emblem, the likeness of God. So the terms images and likeness, they're synonymous, denoting a statue, but it's not a statue of wood and stone that doesn't really live, that doesn't hear, that doesn't see, but humans are created as living statues of their creator, God himself. There was no need of a divine image because humans represented Yahweh. Not any created thing that man can make. Humans themselves represented Yahweh. So, what do we conclude in this biblical theology series that we're looking at the priestly image? He is the royal priest is the image of God. It's the incarnation of God's divine presence. Is it God? No. It's an image. It's a likeness of him to represent him before other people. So, when we go back to the language of Genesis 1 and 2, when we see Adam and Eve, I'm going to put in this tag. They seem to be functioning as priests. He's created them in his image. So why do I say priests? Well, in the garden, some people might look at the garden as like a sacred space. Yeah, a sacred space. Let me see if I can kind of show this to you, and maybe I'll get back to this before I leave. But if you think about the days of creation during the first 6 days, he's separated, right? He's separated on day 1. He's separated on day 2. He's separated on day 3. And there was water. And then all of a sudden, what did he have come out of the water? Land. Now that land represents, earth in a sense. You had water, you had land, you had water, right? Okay. And in that land, what did he create? Let me make sure I get this right. Yeah, in that land, he created a place called Eden. And in Eden, you can read all of this. So he created the land in Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 through 13. He called the land out of this land. He called a particular place Eden from this land. That was in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. And then in Eden, he had a garden. And in that garden, he had, what did he have? The tree of life. I'm going to get back to that at the end, but I think I needed to kind of show that now. This is what happened on day 6. And so when it says Adam was shaped, he was fashioned, he was formed, and he was blew into him the breath of life, and he was taken from there, and he was placed where? In the garden. And it was there in the garden that all of the animals began to come to him, and he began to do what? Name them. So he was serving his God. He was continuing the work that God had started, and he was naming all of them. That's exercising rule. That's exercising authority. And then at some point in time, it's like, I don't have a companion for myself. What's going on, Lord? And God says, okay, I'm going to put you to sleep, and I'm going to create Eve for you. And then he brought Eve, and then they were both there. And they were both had access to this tree of life. And we're going to get back to that hopefully a little bit later. But I'm not done. So when he created them in the garden and he placed them in the garden, now you can go to Genesis 2:15. It says, Yahweh took the man and placed him in the garden to do two things. Can anybody find it? It's in Genesis chapter 2, maybe verse 15. He created man, he placed them in the garden to do what? Anybody have it? Very good. Dress it and to keep it. Based upon your translations, dress it and to keep it could also be translated to work and to serve. Those are the two words, to work and to serve. Or excuse me, to work and to keep it. To work and to keep it. So these two verbs, work and keep, they're significant. Because he's already showing you that I have now created you in my image, and I am now telling you that your purpose is to work and to keep what I have created for you. That's your job. I don't know if you recognize that. I don't know if you know that. And we when we live out our lives in our own houses, in our own yards, isn't that what we're doing? We're working to upkeep it, to maintain it, to keep it. That's kind of the depiction of what he wanted us to do when he created all the stuff for us. And boy, it would have been a lot easier if we just done it that way. And now we got to mow the grass and keep mowing the grass, and there's weeds and there's pollen and there's all these, yellow jackets, nested in some area, and you start, a whole lot of stuff can happen. But the point is that when he created men and he put them in the garden, he gave them two specific things: to work it and to keep it. Everybody turn to Exodus chapter 20. I just want to touch upon this word work. It is the Hebrew word abad, A-B-A-D. And it's used in different places in the scriptures, and I just want to show it to you so you can kind of get a feel for what this word work, abad, means. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your abad, work. 6 days you will do all your work, right? 6 days of creation. God did all of his work. And the seventh day, he ceased. That's what Sabbath means. It means cease. Cease from what? Cease from work. Okay? But the seventh day is the Sabbath day to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any abad, work. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, and all the way through. So abad means to work in that context. You can use that Hebrew word, and it means to work. And then it means something else, and this is where I kind of got ahead of myself, because I also knew that it meant that abad word not only means to work, it also means to serve. So let me show you an example of that. Genesis chapter 27, verse 29. It says, may peoples abad you, and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. So when I said again, may the peoples abad you, it means may the people serve you. Do you understand the context of Genesis 27? Do y'all see what the context is? Who's it about? Isaac. Who? Jacob? Okay. So people were going to serve him. And then we go to Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. Abad means to work. It means to serve. But it's also been translated and it means a third kind of meaning right here. In Exodus chapter 3:20, it says, and God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will abad God on this mountain. That word abad was used. What is it translated in your translations? It says serve there. Worship. That's the third kind of meaning for the same word, the same Hebrew word, abad. And that's the interesting thing. When we come to understand, we're reading a text that was written not just in another language, in an ancient world language. And it's hard for us to understand that in the Hebrew language, not only are the words have certain different shades of meaning, like work, serve, worship, all from abad, but the letters actually mean numbers. So there's like a multiple meaning sometimes, and we talked about biblical numerology, and I'm not getting into that today, but I'm only stating that because sometimes the surface level translations of what we read, sometimes we just got to dig a little deeper. And maybe you'll find out something even more profound than just the surface level. You know, kind of like an iceberg. An iceberg only has 10% on top of the water, and there's 90% of a mountain turned upside down in the water. And there's a whole lot more to that. So I only mention that for that reason. So this word abad that was used when man was placed in the garden, it means to work, it means to serve, it means to worship. Because if you remember, Moses told Pharaoh, let my people go, that we may do what? Go and worship the Lord, our God. That's the word abad. And then there's one more word, it's kind of derived from the word abad, it's aboda. And it means, it's specifically used in the context of priestly service. So let me show you a couple of examples. Numbers 18:7. It says, but you, Numbers 18:7, it says, but you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything concerning the altar and inside the veil, and you are to do your aboda, meaning your priestly service. So it means work, it means to serve, it means to worship, but it also specifically means your priestly service. In other words, your priestly duties. So that's important. Now there's another word in the Hebrew that also means to serve and to keep. It's the word shamar. And it's used in the Bible specifically in reference to priestly service of worship. These verbs are used together as a phrase only in the description of priests and the Levites working in and around the temple. And I'm just going to mention that to you and just drop that there so that you realize that abad means serve, work, worship, and priestly service. But there's another word that also means to serve and to keep, it shamar. And when you look at the translations, sometimes it's abad and sometimes it's a shamar, and they kind of have the same meaning and connotation. So God placed His image in the garden, which some people will look at that whole thing and consider, well, that's like the temple. He placed them in the garden to work and to serve. Well, where did the priest work and serve? In the temple. And so some people will look at that and say, oh, that's like the temple. That's where heaven and earth met and they overlapped. And oh, that's the Garden of Eden. Oh, and that's why they consider that Adam and Eve were created and placed there to start performing their priestly service unto the Lord. So, I was going to get back to this at the end. I told you that. So, think about that and just contrast it with when the Israelites entered the promised land. So let's call this the promised land. So that's a place in, where the Canaanites used to dwell and all of them. And the promised land. It's that where Israel is today. You got the promised land. And they came in with their temple that was a traveling temple, right? And what was this part of the promised land that was the traveling temple? What do we call this area? Do you guys remember? Thank you. The outer court. The outer court. And then inside the outer court, you had this interesting little place here. What's that place? What? Yeah, I guess we could call it that. The Holy of Holies. Oh, no. Yeah, I got that mixed up. Holy place, right? Holy place. And then you had this veil, right? This veil. And you ever notice when you read the scriptures, what was on that veil? And you know what images were put on that veil? Anybody remember? There were trees. Very good. There were trees, but there was also something else. With a flaming sword, cherubim. Hey, wait a second. Isn't that what was left in the garden when man got pushed out? There was a cherubim there. Oh, there's cherubims there. And you were right, there were also trees. What were they trying to remind us of? The Garden of Eden. Right there on that veil. And then what was here? The Holy of Holies. Do you guys see the connection between these two images? As you get deeper and deeper and deeper in, the tree of life was that Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. That was where the presence of God was. So it's akin to that tree of life. So, I felt like sharing that all with you because it was astounding to me. And I think it's important before we move on that before we talk about kings and before we talk about lords and before we talk about prophets maybe and before we talk about, it started out as priests. God wanted a kingdom of kings? No. God wanted a kingdom of lords? No. God wanted a kingdom of priests. And if you think about, I know we live in a fallen world, but do you think the mandate over us has changed because we live in a fallen world? I mean, what was the point of receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost if not to start bringing a restoration back to what he originally intended? It has to start in our hearts. That's why we receive the baptism of the Holy Ghost. And when we learn over time to mature in our faith, to mature in our faith walk, to learn to hear the presence, the voice of the Lord, to learn to be led by him, to learn to walk with him, to follow him, not just me go over here and, oh Lord, just bless everything I do. No. We acknowledge him in all of our ways. We do make our plans. He wants us to use our wisdom. He gave us godly wisdom. Use it, but acknowledge him in all your ways. Don't not acknowledge him and then go say, oh, well, I think I want this and I think I want that and I want to go. And then when you commit yourself and you go to do all of these things, then you turn to the Lord and say, oh, Lord, would you please bless all the things that I'm doing? No. First, acknowledge him in all of your ways. And then what will he do? He makes straight your path. And then you got a nice, not a nice, easy path, but a path that is attainable, that is walkable because you are being filled with the Spirit and you're being led by the Spirit to accomplish all that he requires of you. Amen?